You love me so much more than I could ever know. Your love is deeper than this world will ever show. And all of life's beauty shines around this moment now. The sky and the cliffs, they seem to change my life somehow. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, I will never be the same, never be the same ever again. Well, here I am waiting, Lord, my life is just for you. Please unfold all the plans that you would have me do. And if all the world's just a breath and nothing's here to stay, and all of the love we feel will save us anyway. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, I will never be the same, will never be the same ever again.
Hello and welcome to another SDAQ&A. Ross Cole is my guest in the present and is also my guest in our replay of the interview we did, I think, May 2020. And welcome, Ross. Good to have you here to watch your replay again.
Thank you.
Now, we're currently every week releasing one episode from season 2, where we dug deep into Des Ford and Glacier View and all sorts of topics surrounding that scenario, that event, that occurrence, that time in history that still reverberates around the world to this day. The other day, I ran into someone and I was telling them a little bit about the podcast, and they said, what are you doing this week? And I said, one of the shows I'll be watching back with Ross Cole in an interview I did with him on Glacier View. And this person said, Glacier View, what's that? Now, this particular person is my age, and her husband works in the church and has done his whole life. And I thought, wow, people still don't know about Glacier View. So one of the reasons I'm re-releasing season 2 is to put it into the public realms. Pretty much so far it has been only in the private group on Facebook, and I think it's an important topic to get out there into the world so that people do really know what went on at Glacier View, and they also need to find out some of the things that happened that were a little bit, shall we say, shady. Not saying that you're saying that, Ross, but in my humble opinion, some of what went down and how Des Ford was treated was just really not fair. And until that is addressed, until the church leadership at least addresses the topic, I'll continue to shine a light on it. So, Ross, just quickly tell us. Oh, actually, I think you do in the interview, but just quickly tell us what you're doing at the moment, what you've been doing maybe in the last couple of years since our interview, and then we're going to dive straight into the interview.
Thank you, Peter. At the moment, I'm reading messages from the
In the
commentators.
comments.
One particularly drew my attention. Barry Ford, no relation to the other Fords. I knew in
Yes.
the past he didn't tune it more than half a lifetime back. So it's great to have Barry here. Barry's father, Kevin, was one of the leaders in the local church, and he was very knowledgeable on this topic. I wouldn't say I always agreed with his conclusions, but he was one of the most self-educated men in theology that I knew.
Wow. And that's Barry's father, did you say?
Kevin.
Right. Right. Yeah, there's always interesting comments, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And at the end of the program, so we're going to watch season 2, episode 4, together, and with the online audience and those who watch it later on, and then we'll have a bit of a chat about it at the end, and we'll also look at some of the comments and questions raised then. So before we dive in, just for those who don't know, like my friend that I bumped into the other day, if you go to Wikipedia and search Sanctuary Review Committee, the Sanctuary Review Committee, it gives you the best background story to Des Ford, Glacier View, and what happened. So if you just need a bit of background, because we kind of dive in as if everyone knows a bit about what's going on. So go and look at Wikipedia and and just search Sanctuary Review Committee, and you'll have a great introduction to this topic. Well, also just want to thank SDA Kinship, the Seventh-day Adventist Kinship International, for sponsoring today's program, and Floyd and everyone over there are great supporters of this channel, and we're pretty pleased to promote their good work today, and thank them for being sponsors of today's program. And they're easy to find. Just go and see sdakinship.org and learn all about them. In fact, Ross, Floyd and I did an interview together, and we went through the membership online, live online, on how to become a member, and I joined up, and we filled out all the forms and
Right.
whatnot. It's very easy, and so anybody who is a supporter of SDA kinship, whether you're gay or straight or anything in between or beyond, you're welcome, and they just appreciate the support. So sdakinship.org. Now let's get the other screen up, and we will begin, and hopefully I'm just hoping on friends watching to give us a nod if you can't hear it. And I think we're ready to go. Any quick thoughts, Ross, before we dive in, or shall I press the play button?
Press the play button.
Here we go, everybody. Season 2, Episode 4, Ross Cole, Dr. Ford, Glacier View.
It says now streaming live on Facebook.
It's streaming live. See, on mine, it says it hasn't happened yet. There we go. It says it's live now. Let me press a few buttons. And we'll just give a couple of minutes for people to join. There we go. And I've set up a bit of a monitor on the side here, so hopefully I can, if people do ask questions or make comments, I can kind of refer to them as well.
Yeah.
And so we'll just wait a couple of seconds, and then I'll officially begin. It's always good to have 10 or so people at least on board as we start. And so yeah, we're getting a good number turning up now.
Okay.
Here we go. Hello and welcome to another SDA Q&A. I'm Peter Dixon, and joining me today is Ross Cole. How are you, Ross?
Hello, everyone. Well, thank you.
And it's great to have you here on our special reflective series on Glacier View, and what led up to it, the goings on during it, and also the impact that I think you and I would agree continues to this day within the Adventist Church. So I'm looking forward to chatting with you about this, because in the last week I realised we share some common ground on some theories, and you helped to shift some of my thoughts on this.
Okay.
And before we begin, I do want to just thank everyone for all the comments and emails that are coming in. We've really hit an incredible nerve in a way where some people have been, were greatly hurt by the events, confused, kept in the dark, overexposed. All sorts of things have happened, and when we've chatting about it, I think there's a sort of catharsis that happens. And I've had many emails this week, 15 or 20 a day, where people are just saying that they are feeling a bit of healing. So that kind of is great, because my aim has been to not open old wounds, but I think to reflect on something that has never really been spoken about publicly so much, and because of social media we can really do that now, in an attempt to not necessarily reconcile and everybody be happy buddies and friends, but just in a way to kind of bring some healing and catharsis to the experience. So thank you for being part of the interviews. We've got some really great interviews coming up this week, and they've been posted on the wall if people want to have a look. Coming up on, I think it's Thursday, I'd better just check. Yep, Thursday at 10:30 our time. We've got a very interesting interview coming up with Dr. Ken Samples, who is a protege of Walter Martin. And he's going to be giving us lots of information about questions on Doctrine and how that book came about, and the ensuing thoughts that Walter Martin had about that as well. But here we are with Ross Cole, and before we kick off, Ross, for those that don't know who you are, tell us a little bit about yourself, and just a bit of a rundown on what you're up to now as well.
Sure. I was remote from Glacier View at the time. I was 21 in 1980 and a theology student in my final year at Avondale College. I then entered pastoral ministry, worked in South New South Wales for 5 years, in North New Zealand for 2 years, and then was a missionary in Papua New Guinea for the next 4 years near Rabaul at Sonoma Adventist College. Then at division expense, I was very privileged. I did doctoral studies at Andrews University in Michigan. That was about 4.25 years, and then I was 7.5 years back in Papua New Guinea at Pacific Adventist University, and then I came to Avondale College after that. And about 5 years back, I took some health leave from Avondale. I'm still attached to it. I'm an adjunct lecturer on their books, senior lecturer, but I'm no longer working there. I've been married, I'm divorced, I have 2 children in their 20s. Boy named Sheldon, a girl named Alicia.
And I remember Alicia having lessons in my music shop years ago.
Yes, she hasn't persisted with the music, but I'm so glad that she took up that opportunity.
Who was her teacher?
Pushed me to take it up.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Who was it teaching her at the time?
Felix.
That's right. Yeah, great teacher.
Yeah.
Great musician too. So we're a similar kind of vintage. You were
at Avondale some of the time I was.
Yeah, and I started Avondale at 81. And
oh, really? Well, I finished in 80, but I remember you from those days.
Yeah, but I lived in the area, I was at school, and I spent most of my time hanging around Avondale. And,
so much so I thought you were a fellow Avondale College student. Yeah.
At the same time, yeah. And so, one of and I remember you from those times as well.
Yes, likewise.
And then kind of reconnecting again, when, as we said, when your daughter was having lessons. In recent years, one of the things I've really valued about having you involved in a meeting is your incredible prayers. You have an amazing ability to pray in such a way that just makes us feel all included and kind of brought into a beautiful sacred space. So
thank you.
I want to thank you for the prayers you've done in various meetings that I've organised.
And that's not the sort of thing that can be premeditated. It comes from
the
moment.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that's one of the things that a lot of people in meetings, they're a bit nervous and they kind of prepare and they read it, or they do a very short prayer. But yours are heartfelt and not premeditated.
Okay.
So thank you for that. So to the topic, as you said, like you graduated in 80. And kind of really ground zero of Glacier View, August of that year would have been kicking off at Avondale.
Yes, we had at least 2 of our lecturers, Arthur Furch and Norm Young, away at Glacier View, and then they were at follow-up meetings, and some of the other lecturers were variously engaged in such things. So it was a semester where the lecturers were absent a lot. Yeah.
And did you remember, like, for me being in town at the time, a little bit younger than you, we were kind of kept in the dark a little bit, and I do remember lots of American preachers coming along and reassuring us about how wonderful everything was in the church. And I remember one pastor was talking about Ellen White, and just there was lots of glowing things going on. We didn't really know what was happening with the controversy, but with you actually being a theology student, were you aware of discussions on campus at that time?
I was part of discussions on campus, I guess. Arthur Patrick was a good source of information, measured, as Arthur always was. But a good source of information would sometimes put notes up about what was happening, which I think may have got him into a bit of trouble, but he wasn't inflammatory.
Right.
Alex Curry, who was around Kurrumbong these days, he was Dean of Students, and I remember having a meal or 2 with him just to chat about what was happening. And then when Arthur Furch and Norm Young came back, they were quite open. I remember a group of us, particularly in the last 2 years of theology, I think it was, going out to his house one Sabbath afternoon just after he arrived back. So we didn't feel we were really kept in the dark. And in fact, it was a very good environment to be in when all this happened. I feel some concern about what happened to some of my colleagues who were a year or two ahead of me and out in the field, and probably feeling very isolated at the time, whereas we were in a protected environment where our initial reactions were not judged and not yet subject to rules of employment or anything like that. So we had time to sort through ourselves.
Mm. So where did you say you went again in 81?
South New South Wales. I was assisting in Albury Church, and then for 3 years I was in Tumut in the Snowy Mountains, and then for 1 year I was up at Bowral and Goulburn churches.
Oh, beautiful part of the world, all those places. So did you find, as you went out into the grassroots local churches, that was lots of talk about Glacier View and Des Ford and getting defrocked? Was there kind of conversation going on?
There was awareness of it. I don't think it was much concern to the average church member, if you can talk of such of anyone being average, really, because we're all different. But those who had been to Avondale, I would say, one or two church members who'd actually been on the staff at Avondale at some point. The head elder, interestingly enough, said to me, "We don't want to hear anything about the controversies about the sanctuary or about righteousness by faith." And word of this being said got back to one of the elders and said, "Well, we don't want to hear about the controversies about the sanctuary, but we do want to hear about righteousness by faith."
Oh, interesting. I kind of felt like we were fairly free to talk about it up until, I don't know when. When do you think you started having to be careful what you said, or you might lose your job kind of scenario? Not for you, but just generally speaking.
Yes. That's a good question, and it's so complicated because people fare differently in different conferences. You know, Bob Parr was a very open, inclusive man. He set them up with meetings with himself not present, even for ministers to talk through the issues for themselves. I imagine if you were in his conference, it was very safe. Some other places were not quite safe. And then there are the clashes and variations of personality that come into it as well. Plus just happenstance sometimes. I think some people got smashed over because they were plain unlucky.
Yeah, okay. So where I just alluded before that something you'd said on Facebook in the last few days kind of it really resonated with me and shifted some of my perspective is just to give a bit of background on that, you were talking about questions on doctrine,
Yes.
which I've always said is ground zero to Glacier View. And a lot of people have said, "Oh, no, we had 1888 and we've always had left and right swings and pendulum swings." But we've had 1919 and 1903 about Ellen White was with A.G. Daniels kind of almost fighting in a way. And she was wanting to not have a centralized global leadership thing. So there's been lots of ups and downs and controversies and moments of crisis. But the difference, in my opinion, with Questions on Doctrine being released is we had a book sanctioned by the division that kind of wanted to please the evangelicals in the world in a way, but also wanted to express a little bit of a progression for Adventism, a step forward. And and now later, as we talk, we'll unpack why it was so significant to Glacier View. But what you had said on Facebook, where you were really touched by that book, read it a lot, and it made me realise that in the past I've kind of said, well, you know, there's the left and right, the conservatives, just give them the church back because it's the birthright, it's the DNA of what they're talking about is Adventism. But the way you talked about Questions on Doctrine, and I had a similar thought when I chatted to Dr. Don Roy as well, that book created almost a fertile garden for people to embrace Adventism in a new way that became very meaningful. And as I've said before, the church quadrupled in the next 20 years, largely because of the release of that book, because it presented Adventism in a little bit more of a gracious kind of tone. So tell us a little bit about the book, why it influenced you, and if you think my theory holds some water, that in fact it is the more progressive Adventists do have a leg to stand on when they say, hang on, this is the church I'm fighting for, and it might be different to the church that the more conservatives are fighting for.
Well, Questions on Doctrine was published before I was born.
Yeah.
My mother had an old copy with her maiden name in it, and that was in our library at home. I was a precocious kid. I read up on all, I got, for one of my birthdays, I got a copy of the extracts of Daniel and Revelation from the Adventist Bible Commentary, and I thought my day was made to get that as a gift. So I was an unusual teenager, perhaps. But I grabbed that Questions on Doctrine and read it, and I was not aware it was controversial. I didn't know the background. The controversial issues centred particularly around what it said about the nature of Christ and what it said about the atonement being finished on the cross. It wasn't those parts that particularly attracted my attention. I'd read things like, I've forgotten the name of some of them. I'd read some of Arthur Maxwell's message books, as we call them, and so forth. But what I found in Questions on Doctrine I found it intellectually interesting, concise, to the point, not talking down to people, not assuming you knew nothing to start with, nor assuming you knew everything. So it's a whole style of the questions that Martin and Barnhouse had put to them, and the answers appealed to me. It was years before I saw The Truth About Seventh-day Adventism, Walter Martin's book, but I was aware of Doctrinal Discussions. You've heard of Doctrinal Discussions, Peter?
No, it's a book, is it?
It's a book that was published in response to Martin's book.
Oh,
So Questions
no,
on Doctrine was published with his and Barnhouse's questions.
Yes.
Then he wrote his book on Adventists, and then the Ministerial Association published Doctrinal Discussions
Was
as
that
a
with
response to
F.D.
Martin's
Nichols?
book.
Or was that F.D.
So that was in my grandfather's library, and I was aware of some of the discussion from that, and it's linked to Questions on Doctrine.
Because Questions on Doctrine was written by released by Martin and Barnhouse, but in great consultation with 3 or 4 key Adventist kind of
At least 3 or 4.
leaders. Yeah.
Leroy Edwin Froome, I think Cottrell was involved. Heppenstall, was he involved? I don't know.
I'm not
He
sure.
was certainly involved in doctrinal discussions afterwards.
Yeah.
And I remember reading Martin saying that the idea was that Questions on Doctrine and The Truth About Seventh-day Adventism would both be sold in Adventist bookstores. They weren't. It didn't quite work that way. But Doctrinal Discussions was. And since my grandfather was an Adventist pastor and bought such things, I had a little bit of insight from that book as well.
So you greatly valued the book, and
it gave me my basis of argumentation for things like the Sabbath, law and grace, even Antiochus Epiphanes in Daniel 8, although I wouldn't necessarily agree with all that was in the book now. But those things, including the sanctuary elements, ironically, considering the root of fermentation that it became, I got my grounding in that book.
Were you aware at the time that it was kind of suggesting some slightly different views to what had previously been held?
No, I wasn't, because I hadn't read the controversial material about it.
That's my theory, that people that came across this book saw this as Adventism, and therefore that became, they had a sense of ownership to the Adventism that was presented in this book. They weren't aware of the differences of the nature of Christ and the various other differences.
Those things weren't the things that drew my eye in the book.
Yeah, yeah. And I think
it was more about the Sabbath, law and grace, second coming.
Yeah.
The Adventist staples.
So what changed, do you think? Like, why were people so opposed to that book?
Well, I've read since that it was statements on the nature of Christ that were particularly concerning to people. And to be honest, I hadn't thought much about that issue at the time I read the book. I came from, there's a couple of things that may influence here. My family, my grandparents came into the Adventist Church through the influence of one of my grandmother's cousins, Louis F. Weir, an Australian evangelist, and he was a progressive in his own right. He was very much into discussion on the King of the North and the King of the South. Yeah. When others saw Turkey attacking in the land of Israel, he said, we've got to take a Christocentric approach where we look at this being an issue involving an attack upon the church as the body of Christ. So spiritual Armageddon and all those things were his field. And a lot of that is assumed by and large today, but was fairly radical and progressive at the time. So that was part of the background I had. My grandfather, I would say, was theologically conservative, probably not deeply interested in complex theological things, but a deeply loving man and very flexible in his own marvellous way, despite his theological conservatism. So he was so impactful upon the other ministers in the town where he worked that a couple of Presbyterian ladies became Adventists, and they actually gave them letters of transfer to the Adventist church, recommending them for their fellowship. So that was a sort of, he clearly wasn't being seen as a sheep stealer.
Yeah.
They accepted him as a fellow minister and they worked with him in that sort of issue. And then my great-grandfather, his father, became an Adventist, but he was too old to be baptised, so they dry cleaned him, Peter. I only found this out recently from my mother, that he was accepted into fellowship without actually being immersed in water. And to me, that's almost scandalous. But he was such a loving, inclusive man, he wasn't going to let him miss out on church membership just because he felt too old to be dipped.
Yeah. Wow. So that's a couple of generations there of Adventist.
Well, it goes back to my great-great-grandfather, one of them anyway. And I only found that out reading Milton Hook's work on Louis F. Weir. I didn't know that he had become an Adventist. He became one. His grandson, Louis Weir, became one and went off to college in 1905. So the link to Avondale goes back over 100 years. And then he came to town, invited his cousin and aunt along, and that's how my great-grandmother and grandmother became Adventists. And my grandfather was one of the converts at the meetings as well. So that was how they met.
So where were you living before you came to college?
Oh, my dad worked for the Sanitarium Health Food Company, so we travelled all around the place.
Right.
So we lived in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth. Well, we went to Perth soon after I went to college.
And where were you born? Melbourne. Right. So back to QOD, often called QOD.
QOD.
A group of people began to feel that the church was being stolen away from them, and this is where I feel personally, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, that this idea of a pendulum swing where we go standards shift and change, and sometimes we're more liberal, sometimes we're more conservative. This is where it starts to shift away from that normal thing that does happen in every movement, where people started getting organised and wanting to fight for their church to come back. When did you become aware, is that right? Is that accurate? When did you become aware, for example, of the Standish Brothers, the Concerned Brethren, the letter that
only when I
went to
Avondale
division?
as a student.
Right.
Because Des Ford was a teacher at the college for the first 6 months I was there.
Right.
I grew to know the man in later years. I think you would scarcely have a memory of me from those 6 months. It was a very large class. But we students would get mail from the Concerned Brethren in the village about how bad this man was. And when he left to go to America, the mail stopped.
Oh.
So I came in that way aware of the extent of controversy surrounding some things.
So do you think that in some ways this movement that took off really around the Concerned Brethren, and I've done a bit of study into the links that some of the independent fundamental ministries have with the Standish Brothers and Heartland, and there's a thread going back to all of them, which they go back to the 16 or so pastors that signed this document. And I'm not even criticising them. I think they too have a leg to stand on, saying that, hey, we want our church back, just like people who came into the church based on questions on doctrine say, hey, no, this is our church, we want this to remain the same. Do you see a trajectory like that as well? And what are your thoughts on the idea of the Concerned Brethren movement expanding and growing?
That's a good question. I think on the nature of Christ, the link becomes evident with perfectionism. The Concerned Brethren wanted to maintain a model where Christ had shown us how to live in sinful nature, and therefore we could do the same. So those two things became linked together, and that did not sit comfortably with other emphases on righteousness by faith.
So what do you think Des was saying that was different?
I don't think Des was necessarily the only one.
No.
The most prominent, but Hans Laurendale, who later brought Louis F. Weir's copyrights, he was also opposed to perfectionism. So was Edward Heppenstall. They published a book called Perfection, the Impossible Possibility, with various perspectives in it. Laurendale, Heppenstall, Herbert Douglas on the other side. And there was someone else involved as well, but I don't think it was Des, but there was someone else involved as well. So the issue was being discussed. Yes, it was out there. In some ways, I think we've got to say that although Jesus, I believe, had a sinless nature, he bore the effects of sin upon his nature. As even Des used to say, though he wasn't always heard, he didn't come at the height of Adam. Okay. Silver can be pure just as gold can be pure.
Yeah. Wow,
even though it is not of the same standing. So his human nature was affected but not infected by sin. And in those passages where it emphasizes the similarity of Jesus' nature to ours, the purpose appears to be for our comfort, not for our desperation. So when it says be like Jesus, it says be like Jesus who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but humbled himself. So it goes to what was basic about his divinity as a model for our humanity. And when it speaks about his humanity, it is for our comfort. We can have help in time of temptation, as Hebrews 2 says, because we have someone who understands temptation. I don't see it being presented as, he is like us, therefore you better get out there and do it too.
Yeah, which is kind of, I guess, the difference between this left and right that we're talking about. And you're right, and I think chatting to Norm Young the other day, he listed off a bunch of names that that were kind of going along the same kind of path that Des was. So it seems like this kind of natural, organic, new perspective, new theology was kind of happening and growing. But then, would you agree there was a movement growing that was definitely trying to stop this new theology?
Well, I never called it new theology. It was, as I said, I came in on questions on Doctrine. But I became aware at Avondale from the correspondence I got from the village that there were certainly people who were not very happy.
And if you look, if you look at Glacier View and Ford being given the boot, for want of a better phrase, that was a bit of a culmination or a bit of a win there, do you think, for that movement?
It's questionable, because I would say that the sinful nature of Christ and perfectionism and so forth, it was emboldened in this division by what happened to Des, but I don't think it ever entirely took over.
When you look at...
Well, I remember Athol Tolhurst coming back from the meetings at Glacier View and saying how he disagreed with Des on the sanctuary, but didn't disagree with him on righteousness by faith. Now, others may dispute whether that's an accurate reflection of his views, but that was his own perspective. And I don't know too many of the leadership who came back saying that Christ did it and so must we. I didn't detect that emphasis.
From him, did you say?
From anyone much in leadership. From people in retirement, yes, but from anyone in current leadership, I don't really recall hearing that. Now, that doesn't mean that they were full-on gospelers. You know, I remember Keith Parmenter, for example, saying it's good to say nice things about the gospel, but this is one of the fundamentals, you know.
Mm.
So, and you would feel, oh, that's sort of minimizing the gospel with faint praise there. But there wasn't to my discernment as a student and a young pastor, there wasn't an attempt to drive us into perfectionism.
So it may have been more of a political thing going on at a kind of academic and theological and administration level, where there was more vying for power, do you think?
Well, Des was a real force of nature. Very hard to advise to do something. Very easy, I understand, to command to do something. If his employer told him, do not do this, he would not do it.
Mm.
Always utterly polite
Mm.
when other people were losing their cool. And I think that combination of intelligence, politeness, clear focus, and lack of what scholars often have as a tendency to try and work out a way of speaking that will please everyone. Yeah.
Mm.
It used to remind me that the scholar in Shakespeare was Hamlet, who could never act decisively.
Mm.
And I think that combination of traits made it pretty hard for him to escape being the centre of some people's wrath, unfortunately.
Mm. Mm.
But the administrator is not primarily necessarily a theologian.
No.
They're trying to find a way for everyone to live together. And I can imagine them trying to say, we will take the righteousness by faith bit, even if they didn't fully understand it, but we'll reject this other bit.
Yeah.
And feeling that would please everyone and probably ended up pleasing not too many.
Yeah, by the sounds of it, Neil Wilson wanted the topic to end and was hoping that that Glacier View would kind of draw a line in the sand and it would end the discussion, but it kind of had the opposite effect in a way, didn't it?
Well, if you read what Raymond Cottrell wrote about it, he spoke about the Pearson years as years of obfuscation, where things were not discussed. And I imagine that Neil Wilson was like a breath of fresh air, and someone was going to put their foot in the water and say something a little bit radical and disturb the waters after so long with things being suppressed. And it happened to be that Des was the one who got noticed, at least, doing that.
When you were a young minister out in the field in the early 80s, and you would have noticed that a lot of your peers were leaving the church, quite a high number, in fact, in Australia and the US and the UK as well. Did any of them contact you and talk about what was going on, or did they just leave and disappear?
It's a good question. In South New South Wales, where I went, I don't think there were too many that. There were one or two that left, but I don't think it was over theology necessarily. A lot of them had left in 1980, and some of them left after 1980, but not where I was. So there were a group of them in Western Australia, for instance, who suffered after 1980. Heinz, Susan Bark, Wayne, Colvin was his name, I think. I've forgotten his surname exactly, but they, I didn't have a real lot of contact with them, and social media wasn't what it is today.
Imagine if we had social media.
You could ring them up, but that would cost you a fortune back then.
Yeah. That's why these discussions we're having are quite unique, because they're just out there on social media, and no one can pretty them up or hide them or suppress them. They're just floating out there and in a public forum.
You can always edit them.
Yeah, that's right. For members of the Facebook group, we'll keep them here nice and
yes, they
nice
can
and
see
long,
it unedited, see it
when
in the raw.
when they make it to, and on the podcast as well. But when they get to YouTube, they'll be a lot shorter, I think. But I'll try and keep the intent of each conversation the same. So you and I would agree that QAD had a huge emphasis in the sense of creating an aspect of Adventism that was quite appealing to a lot of people, and I can see how that still resonates through even the way you're talking now. You've grasped a kind of Adventism that is quite a beautiful thing, and I know lots of people on the same page as you would definitely acknowledge that. I've got perhaps a little bit more of a side of me that's going. I think there's been an organised kind of trying to fight between the two, which you might not agree with so much. But when you listen to a lot of material by some of the more fundamental conservative ministries, they see the you of the world as being part of the new theology and part of this shaking and part of this omega that is spoken of. So they definitely have a defined us and them feel, and I think it's
Sure.
great that you don't, but they definitely do. And from their perspective, and I've chatted to quite a few in different interviews, feel that this is now their time. They are now coming into political power. Ted Wilson's now president. The compliance document has certainly sent shivers up and down many a worker of the church. And with the women's ordination no vote coming in, they're quite pleased with the direction that I believe started from the Concerned Brethren movement. Am I being overly dramatic with that view?
It may not be clear cut and dried as it seems. I don't think everyone who's opposed to women's ordination is necessarily a perfectionist.
No,
I don't think
of
it
course
follows.
not. Yeah, no.
And the stereotype that the Western world is liberal and the mission world is conservative is not quite accurate either.
Exactly.
I met people who were conservative in Papua New Guinea in my ministry, but they weren't rigidly conservative. They were open to new ideas and suggestions and were mainly concerned about getting the message out and didn't actually mind if the women helped do the work, you know.
Yeah.
So the categories may not be quite, the conflicts are real, but I don't think everyone is divided simply into one camp or the other.
That's right. It's not as black and white. I'm definitely not saying it's black and white. I guess I'm saying that that some people from if there isn't a general left-right difference, some people on the conservative camp are definitely stereotyping.
They do feel it's their hour.
Yeah, it's their hour, and
I've drawn back from it a bit. No longer in active employment in the church, though I do voluntary things. I may feel very differently if I was at the start of my ministry. I do look at things like what's been happening in the politics surrounding women's ordination, for example, and it could drive me to despair.
Yeah.
If I was a younger minister, it might indeed.
I really like your perspective. I think it's one that's kind of almost going, you know what, this is my Adventism and this is how I'm going to live it, and I'm not going to kind of let these crisis points get in the way of that connection that you have with the church and with the divine.
It's important to remember that for me it has been that as a pastor and later as a tertiary teacher, that I minister to the church as a whole, not just to people who agree with me. So, you know, it's not America where there's 10 different colleges or universities you can train at to be a pastor. So if I'm a teacher at Avondale, I need to listen respectfully, even to people I don't agree with, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that seems basic. I need to pastor to the whole church in my town, whether they're on the same side of my thinking or not. And what I found is that if people perceived you as loving them and as loving Christ and as being concerned for the Bible and its presentation accurately, they will listen even when they don't agree with you. And you can minister to them even when you don't necessarily agree with everything they're saying either.
One of the takeaway moments of the Norm Young conversation was where he talked about Athol Tolhurst retiring just down the street from him.
That was very moving, wasn't
it? And they would have lunch and go on walks together. I guess, yeah, in my mind, the people that are open to having a diverse Adventism, that kind of creates a definition for that kind of an Adventist. You might some might agree with the women's ordination, some may not. There's a whole variety of views and thoughts and beliefs and opinions they have. But one common thread is that the more I hate saying left and right, liberal, conservative, because it's so it's not as black and white as that. But the more progressive Adventist tends to feel the thread that runs through it tends to be accepting of people with divergent views. The people on
probably to a point.
Yeah.
All of us can be intolerant of intolerance or whatever.
Yeah. But just generally speaking, it's like we'd like to think, at least, that we have that we like a varied and unified church, but a diverse church. Yeah. Whereas perhaps some of the more conservative side are wanting a bit more of a defined kind of church back.
I don't think that the progressive is really the enemy of the conservative if they stop to think about it.
Mm.
The real enemy is indifference.
Mm.
The opposite of truth is not heresy, but indifference, as something I read on Facebook recently reminded me. It is the spirit of secularism that really doesn't care about any of these things. It's far more the enemy. Mm. So the enemy of a concerned brethren view on 1844 is not actually Desmond Ford, but the Adventist doesn't care either way.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And there are a lot of those in practice.
Yeah. And I can err myself to turning these differences that appear, I could become the person making it more defined. And that's what I loved about reading some of your stuff. And a lot of other people have influenced me that way. And it keeps my own perspective open to being less judgmental as well, which I appreciate that. And maybe ongoing conversations can keep that kind of perspective fueled. So when you see the compliance document, which I think Ellen White would be rolling in her grave to see, because in the early 1900s she was very involved, I think, in setting up the unions, as we said earlier, because she wanted to see the unions look after their own different subcultural.
She didn't want kingly power coming from
Didn't
the
want
centre.
kingly power. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because what seems to be happening is kingly power taking over. I spoke to someone the other day and they said, well, that's good. We need to have very defined rules about if you're a member of this church. But Ellen White spoke against that.
Well, she felt that those who were near the situation in the field understood it better than those who were in some remote office, and that some of the decision-making power therefore needed to be delegated to other levels rather than to simply centred in Battle Creek, as it was at one stage at least.
So when you see the compliance document not only being talked about, but actually passed almost into policy, and 6 unions in the Autumn Council were warned, and 2 were about to be sanctioned, but there was a bit of a vote that turned it into just a warning.
And one of the unions asked to be warned.
That's right. That's right.
We have a confession to make. We have done the same thing.
Yes, exactly. Excuse me, we've not been included. We want to be warned as well.
It's very disturbing
I love
because
that.
to me, leadership at the highest level, and I'll say this cautiously, but needs to be about bringing people together, not about compromising beliefs, but about getting people dialoguing rather than being perceived as jumping on one side of a discussion all the time.
Yes, yes. But do you worry, though, that with that kind of kingly power, the warnings given out to the unions, those union leaders, there'll be people in the unions and conferences that don't want to go to reprimand stage and then go to sanction stage,
I
that will
think they
filter
may.
down
I
to the
think some may
grassroots?
enjoy being reprimanded.
I know, but are you worried that that's going to lead to a point where this concept of being able to carry on with the beautiful kind of ministry that you have is going to be in jeopardy?
Perhaps I'm overly optimistic. I see the church almost running at least two different levels. There's those concerns politically with the GC in particular, and then there is what happens.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know, my experience with the church has always been supportive. As an employee, I always felt supported in whatever crisis I had and understood and
Yeah.
obeyed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think that will change. But then perhaps in this part of the world, we're a little bit on the edge of the empire.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I've always felt I would often be criticised for music. You know, from
Yes.
1980 or 81, I remember being told that did I know that by tapping my foot I was connecting with the devil, and
I remember the CBs publishing a little bit about you back in the
yeah,
early 80s and the bush
I know,
dancers. And
I know, and it's
they
continued
wrote
right
more
up till
about you than they did
recently.
about me.
But what was great for me is that the connection I had with the left and right at the grassroots level was really beautiful and always has been and was, and even though I've left the church now, continues to be. My beautiful connections just continue on, which I'm really grateful for. And yeah, I'm possibly less optimistic.
Yes,
Than
no,
you.
I do understand that. I've noticed your posts and speeches.
But I, as you can tell, I'm very open to being wrong, and I really value the things
It
that
would
you.
be nice if you are wrong. I think we'd all agree on that.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
know,
doesn't
I
mean you
know.
are, but it would be nice.
And I know there's lots of people that disagree with me. And in my interview with Dr. Johnson, you know, he feels hope and positivity for the church. We're going to be having an interview, I think, on Wednesday with John Rosier. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yes.
And he may not see that as positively as some do, but that's what I want to do.
Maybe what it is in part for me, Peter, and I know your parents were in Papua New Guinea, and no doubt you were growing up some of the time
Yeah,
as well.
I was born in
You were
Rabaul
born there,
and
which is
lived
more
in
than I can say.
Kambubu.
But seeing the impact on people's lives there, mainly for the good,
Yeah.
has given me a lot of optimism about what Adventism can be. Now, like any good thing, it can go bad, you know. And I look at some of the conspiracy theorizing and, dare I say it, the anti-vax elements and all that. I don't want to group them all in one category, but it confuses me when I see the positivity about what Adventism has done in those people's lives that I've worked with and ministered with. And on the other hand, those seem to me to be on sidetracks.
I love that about your personality. I know I've occasionally said things even in chatting with you, and you've been like, well, okay, you know, and it's great because it kind of diffuses my my solidarity movement. Let's make some changes.
Well, let's make some changes, but that's not, it's a long haul thing, isn't it? I remember missionaries would sometimes come to Papua New Guinea and say, what are you doing for the local people? Do this, do that. And then 6 months later, sadly, some of them would be gone, burnt out.
Yeah.
So you sort of got to maintain a steady pace and say,
Yeah.
we'll get there in the end.
Yeah. Can I just read? I'm just noticing there's people making comments and stuff.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I just want to address something that Ruth Ellen Marks, Ruth Ellen, well,
Her dad was my roommate at college for a year.
right. Well, that's very interesting. And I've don't have my proper glasses on. I'm not sure her married name is not. I can't see, but it's Ruth Ellen,
Mark.
and it was Marks. I'm not sure if her married last name is.
But her married name is Macht. So a
Right.
minor change there, Ruth Ellen. But
Yes.
first two letters are the same.
And of course, her dad was one of the signees of the Concerned Brethren of the document.
Or her grandfather, more
I'm
probably.
sorry, not her dad, her grandfather.
He was a very gracious man.
Raglan,
I
isn't it?
remember he ran a bus company around Coorambong, and
That's
a
right.
friend of mine and I, he picked us up at the train station one day, and he dropped us right back up at
Oh,
the
yeah.
college gate, and that wasn't on the route, so he went out of his way.
And that's why I wanted to highlight this, because I kind of want to reassure her that um, in this town, Coorambong, which was kind of ground zero really in many ways for the Concerned Brethren, or at least when a lot of them were retired ministers, or when they did retire, they all came here. That because it was Raglan, wasn't it? Raglan was his name.
Raglan.
And he was a great guy. Like I remember growing up until Glacier View, really getting on very well with the left and the right. And he was one on the left, and I knew he was conservative, and he would make comments as a young boy. I'd be on the bus that he was driving, and he'd make comments about my hair being a bit long in the day. But we got on well. And so she said here, did Grandad fund the push against Des? Wow, he'd roll in his grave about how I turned out then. And so
It's
Ruth
our
Allen,
children and grandchildren that educate us, isn't it?
yeah. And I guess
Yeah, you need to remember that Barbara Marx, Raglan's wife, Ruth's grandmother, was on the division committee.
yes,
So even though Raglan had a bit of a reputation for being off on the side, that clearly did not, depends which way you look at it, but to my mind, that did not prejudice the powers that be against his family or against his wife, who I understand from all I've heard served well in that position.
yeah,
So people are bigger sometimes than we perceive them to be.
yeah. And I think what I've learnt from chatting to you and chatting to more conservative people is that I actually can see why they have skin in the game. Like I actually don't disrespect the Concerned Brethren for doing what they did. Some
Well,
were a bit.
it's better to be hanging out for some false ideas, in my opinion, than to be saying none of it matters. You can engage with someone who
That's right.
cares.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. That's a very good point. And that's why I liked kind of growing up in that community, because we would literally have conversations at the takeaway with both kinds, or on the bus. And yeah, for sure, some people watching this today are going to disagree, and they're going to go, I was burnt and hurt and bullied by these guys. And some people are going to say, well, there's some equal kind of progressive Adventism kind of bullying that involves ostracism and
Sure.
nastiness as well. And what I want to say is that each of those stories, if you felt bullied and hurt, your story is just as valid as your story, as my story. And if we can somehow bring these conversations to the table without fear of recrimination, I guess is the nutshell of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
Where we can go, okay, look.
And thank you for doing that.
Oh, thank you. And I really think that people who have some great pain, and can kind of watch these videos and maybe get to share that pain, and that therefore brings about some healing. It may not as well. So we're watching the re-release. I'm here with Ross Cole, and we're both watching an interview that we did together, I think 5 years ago. It's now 2025, and this was done in 2020. And I'm very much enjoying it, Ross, and we'll get back into it in a moment. But I just wanted to thank SDA Kinship International, Seventh-day Adventist Kinship International, for sponsoring today's program. And I'd just love to encourage people to go and check out their website, sdakinship.org. And do you know Floyd, don't you, the president of Kinship? Is that right, Ross?
Yes, good friend of mine. Kinship was a great way to get holidays overseas and to be fellowship at the same time. I went to a few Euro kinship camp meetings over the years, and often people would go away on a holiday in a shared house afterwards, and I joined them for that as well.
They're a really great bunch of people, and they kind of encapsulate what we were just talking about in our interview, this kind of acceptance of diverse people. I think the focus is, unity through diversity, not unity through conformity.
Certainly.
I can imagine a kinship camp meeting and post catch-ups, would just be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I've been putting my hand up to be invited to one of them to lead out worship music. So hint, hint.
Well, you can
So
go whether you're invited or not, but you have to pay
yeah,
your own way.
I'll just take my guitar. Hey guys, just going to sing a few
Yeah.
songs. So yeah,
Yeah.
thank you to SDA Kinship and those watching that Kinship are sponsoring today. Go and check them out. Now I'll see if I can magically return us
I'll just see if
to
there's
our
any other
program.
interesting.
Looks like we're there again. So we'll get back into, there's only about 30 minutes left of the program, but I'm really enjoying it. Those watching, get some questions ready, and Ross will have a little discussion when it's completed. So back to the past. I need to get better glasses. I can see.
It's like it's too much of a concession to our aging, Peter, to do that.
In fact, someone said when you get the technology to be able to see what the comments are, it's going to spoil the flow of the interviews. So
Yeah.
I probably should just switch off the monitor there. But it's interesting technology, isn't it?
Yeah.
So do you mind if I talk a little bit about your being a gay Adventist?
Yeah, it's a loaded term, isn't it?
I hate even
all
saying
that word brings to
I
people's
hate
minds.
even saying it because to me, I don't even like to categorize. I don't even like to categorize left and right. But I feel that it's an important topic because I do get lots of messages from young people that struggle with feeling accepted in the church if they are gay, and because of your incredible positive nature to the church, to the gospel, I think some of what you say actually will positively influence some of these younger kids that are feeling very ostracized and left out in the dark. I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to your experience and advice you would possibly give to some of the younger gay Adventists.
It is, as I said, loaded terminology. I remember knowing I was different, but reading some of James Dobson, who gives very graphic descriptions of what happens in gay bathhouses, and thinking, that's not me, I can't be that.
Yeah.
And the stereotype gets in the way of self-knowledge.
Yeah.
So being gay, as understood outside the church by and large, is a matter of orientation. It's a matter of who you love, who you affiliate with, who you're drawn to romantically. It's not a matter of wild sex addicted behaviour, which can exist in straight people as much as anyone else.
Yeah.
So I guess it is time for respectful conversation, time for listening to where people are really at in themselves and not making assumptions about what self-labelling might mean. Time to listen afresh to the texts and make sure we've understood them properly. My sexual ethics are very conservative. And one of the things about growing up so repressed that I didn't even know who I was means that my sexuality is actually very innocent. Yeah. And they're not the categorizations people often put with it. But people are different. And to young people who are in this position, I would say to have courage and hope, and to know that they need to know that God loves them and accepts them. How that relates to their parents and other people around them, I've been very fortunate. I do feel accepted. But it is not helpful when someone grows up like me, not knowing who they were until their 40s. That is not helpful.
Mm.
And it doesn't require wild experimentation to know who you are. It requires self-acceptance, a willingness to be allowed to know who you are. It doesn't help when that lack of self-knowledge is there. It doesn't help when gay people marry straight people. It's no cure. It is tragedy upon tragedy. And often the way we treat it drives people deeper into unhealthy, even sinful patterns. So that, normally in a heterosexual situation, you would say the person who goes for a marriage and marries is doing better than the one who is having affairs on the side. But that all reverses, not intentionally, but it all reverses when it comes to gay people. Because the one who is admired is the one who may have a bit on the side, but moves on from it and resists temptation. Whereas the one who settles down in a relationship is damned for sure. So the moral priorities get all reversed. And that can have tragic consequences for people's lives.
Yeah. Do gay Adventists have a special bond with each other where they reach out to each other and communicate and support each other in ways that they don't do in public? I mean, in purely in a sense of reaching out, saying, look, I'm having this, I'm just hoping there's some kind of way that people can.
There's a group called SDA Kinship, which started back in the 70s and continues to this day. It's a diverse group because not all of the people in the group are still Adventists. And people are at different stages in their journey. But those links exist, and they exist with other Christians as well.
Okay. And I note, not to go back about the compliance document, I'm not trying to bang on agenda at all.
I think it's going to die, Peter. I think it'll die for lack of getting behind it. I hope so.
Are people expressing concern and upset? Has that pushed people down a little bit? That the gay community with Adventists, is there
That's a good question. I honestly don't think it's made much impact. It would tend to be looked at as more of the same sort of thing. What's disturbing is the areas that are selected for the compliance documents. There's several things disturbing, but that's one of them. There is a general compliance committee, is there not, to deal with distinctive Adventist beliefs? But what about distinctives that are not distinctive? What about things like the Trinity? Why is there not a compliance? I'm not urging a compliance committee on anything.
Gossip.
But why is there not one on the Trinity? Why is there not one on issues of sexual abuse?
What worries me more about the compliance document is that they have to have a committee to decide what compliance issues are to be put in the document, and who gets to monitor and oversee that. I think in the same breath, gossip is spoken of in the Bible as not a very nice thing to be doing. I don't notice that in the compliance document.
We almost need an independent judiciary between the different levels of the church. Yeah. Otherwise, Ellen White's vision of decentralised power goes, and kingly power replaces it.
Yeah. And that's
I can't see that happening. I really don't see we're going to have an independent court to adjudicate between the GC and the unions, for example. But
I think, how ahead of the time was Ellen White to think about the unions in such a way, back in a day when politics and systems in churches weren't a studied science. She kind of knew that a way to protect and stop.
She was a visionary in the true sense of a word, that she could see beyond the narrow interests of the people by and large around her to a broader vista.
Mm.
You know, coming in a different cultural context, very different cultural context, the rate culture changes.
Mm.
In a different time, we can look at her and say, what on earth was she on about? And I used to feel a bit like that till I read the biographies of John Wesley and wondered the same thing.
Mm.
And thought these are cultural things that are getting in the road of my understanding. But that visionary element has helped to bring out the best in Adventism.
Do you
Although
think?
those who've used her in certain ways have brought out the worst as well, I realise.
Do you think she had those kind of words of wisdom because she was a prophet, having actual visions from God, or do you think that she was more of an inspiring woman?
Probably both. Yeah, I don't use Ellen White to settle doctrinal issues for myself. She spoke often enough about not doing that.
Hmm.
To me, the wonderful thing I find in her is her vision of Christ, particularly in the later Ellen White, post 1888, and also her ability to break through conservative boundaries. And I'm not speaking theologically so much here as just simply to do things in new ways,
Mm.
inspire, reaching out to new populations, doing things differently, not being conservative, as she put it.
Mm.
Which was not a theological statement, as I say. It was about not being bound by traditional rules, being able to be experimental.
Some of
And I
the
love the fact that she ate oysters, Peter.
I know that one. I love that story. To me, I'd go, so what? So what? Just because you say you shouldn't be doing something doesn't mean that you
Well,
occasionally
the early
fail.
Adventists were agreed on not eating pig. They weren't necessarily agreed on the unclean animals.
Mm.
And I just love the fact that she breaks our expectations and opens up. You know, I'm not going to race out and eat oysters. That's not my point.
No, I
But
know.
she doesn't fit rigid categories. And some would say, oh, that was hypocrisy. Others would say that was her being true to being who God wants us to be a bit different.
And like I said, I think fine if someone actually has inspiration to say don't eat this or don't have butter on your table or whatever, but and eggs, and does occasionally, that doesn't
Well,
mean
she
that
was
it
writing to
lessens.
particular people. That's the other thing we
Yeah,
confuse with her, is that
yeah,
sometimes her
and
specific counsels are taken as general counsels.
it doesn't lessen the advice, and sometimes she was wrong as well.
Well, yes, she was human.
Around the time of Glacier View, there was the three big kind of crisis moments, the moments of crisis, and Time magazine in America, it got that big that it made the cover of Time magazine, the USA edition, and they talked about the Desford issue, Ellen White and plagiarism, and
That got into Time, did it?
Time magazine, yeah. I'm not sure
I
if it
knew
was
it got into Christianity Today. I'd forgotten about Time
Time
magazine.
magazine. I don't know if it was the actual picture on the cover, but the writing
Yes.
Adventism at the Crossroads, and it was Des
Yeah,
Ford, plagiarism, and the Davenport huge fiasco
sure.
where I think around $20 million, 1979 dollars of church money was used in this Ponzi scheme, which I don't think anyone actually was kind of fully taken to task over that. I think it kind of was just hidden, which you can't do anymore with the internet. But where I was
And I
going,
think what I remember from the time that there was some concern about legal authorities not wanting to be perceived as persecuting a church either.
say that again.
Legal authorities not wanting to be perceived as
Oh
interfering
yes,
inside a church.
yeah,
I
okay.
don't know how true that is. But
Although Neil Wilson did say he was going to take the people to task, and I think Dr. Johnson mentioned they did come up with some names, and he said that he was glad that those names didn't get published, naming and shaming, because it turned out that 2 or 3 on that list were totally exonerated of any fault.
yeah.
And look, maybe they were reprimanded behind the scenes.
Well, Ponzi schemes have not ended.
Oh,
I'm not talking about the church here, but there
we,
uh,
we we should
That is
probably
not
not
to
go,
approve it, but just say
probably
that
not go down that path, or we might have legal action taken against us. But there's been some
I've
recent,
had friends who've lost money in
yeah.
Ponzi schemes. Yeah.
And the thing of recent times has not been church money, but there's been some leadership that just made some errors of judgment, and that's okay. We all fall into those kind of traps.
Well,
Where
I was the deputy vice chancellor of Pacific Adventist University, and saw the administrative side of things as well as you know working from the other side. It is a little bit different in education. I think the agendas of administration may be a little bit different, but you quickly learn how easily you can be misunderstood,
yeah.
and
Oh,
you
yeah.
can't go into defensive mode very easily. It only makes things worse to try and defend yourself. Sometimes you've got to let it just brush off like water on a duck's back,
Exactly.
because to try and say anything actually makes it worse and may involve breach of confidentiality and so forth.
Yeah. It's where I was going with that whole kind of spiel was that how were you impacted by Walter Ray's book, The White Lie, when it came out? It's ironic that I didn't know anything about Davenport. I didn't know much about Glacier View, but someone around 1984 or 85 gave me a copy of The White Lie. I had to stop reading it after a couple of chapters because it just shattered me. And I was just a young
I saw
fella.
the book in Coorong. I never actually read the book.
Right. So, but those kind of the stories that came out about that, did it shake your faith at the time?
No, because I'd been to Avondale, and at Avondale we understood from guys like Don Hanson, and I wouldn't say Des because he wasn't my teacher at that point, but it was part of a general knowledge that there had been some level of copying going on.
Mm.
It wasn't total news.
Yeah, right.
And the way I was viewing Ellen White was in terms of practice rather than defining every element of theology. When we said we didn't place her on the same level as the Bible, I didn't.
No.
Others may have in practice. I didn't. So these things didn't deeply disturb me as such. I don't think we knew the full extent of it. But of course, we were reminded that the people said the same about some things in the Bible as well, with copying and adaptation of what was used. And she copied, but she also altered as she copied. And yeah, it becomes more a matter of interest to me rather than a matter of loss of faith.
When I researched and found out about the copying in the Bible, that made me a bit shaken there too. I have that personality, don't I? When you and I faced with something, I run down a different rabbit hole than you. But at the end of the day, I always feel that if we talk about it, that's how you can demystify, that's how you can remove some of the pain instead of trying to hide it and cover it up. I'd much rather Adventists just talked about all of that stuff.
Well, in Psalm 29, it's interesting, it's a Psalm of David, but it's a different sort of psalm. It's a psalm about the god of the storms. And of course, the other god of the storms in ancient legend was Baal. And as you go through it, it's got very heavy parallelism. It repeats a lot more than in the normal psalms. And they found that in the area of Ugarit in archaeology, they've discovered this sort of heavy parallelism in some of the poetry there.
Right.
But what is interesting is even the letters for Baal, the Bet and the Ayin and the Lamed, play along in the psalm. And if you put Baal in instead of Yahweh, it becomes perfectly balanced. It's very clear that what's happened is that they've taken a hymn from Baal worship and changed it, appropriated it, taken it as their own. And that doesn't throw my faith. It actually excites me.
Yeah, well, you've got an inquiring mind. What were you lecturing at Avondale?
Mainly Old Testament. Occasionally dabbled in world religions and other subjects where we would team teach some things, but mainly Old Testament.
And what was your PhD?
It was on the Old Testament law. It was on the Sabbath and the holy times prescribed in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible, and whether there were indications in the Old Testament itself that these were somehow different, that the Sabbath was somehow different to the others. And I dutifully found the answer yes.
You found the answer.
I found the answer I was looking for. How's that?
The answer is 42.
The answer is 42. The
we-
question's unknown.
Yeah, we're kind of.
I grew sick of the topic. Some people do their dissertations and can never talk about anything else the rest of their lives. I grew so tired of that topic.
It gets so specific, doesn't it?
More and more about less and less.
Yes, yeah. This might be for another podcast, and I'd love to chat to you about it after this series, and I'd love to chat to Bronwyn Reed about it. I was chatting to her one day after a Now meeting we had, and she really framed the gay topic for me in a lot of what the Bible is saying about homosexuality has been misinterpreted, and she really framed some interesting perspectives on it that I'd never thought of before. So we won't kind of go into that now, but I'd love to chat with you more because I'm sure you have researched similar things
Sure.
that she has. Yeah.
Yes, well, I'm as opposed to what happens in Romans chapter 1 as anyone else would be.
In what
When
way?
you look at what it's actually describing, and this is not the time to get into it in any depth, I'm sure, but when you look at what it's actually describing, it is repulsive to most Christian gay people as well.
Yeah, yeah. It's like people like to. I love cherry picking, but not when it's cherry picking to kind of maneuver and push something that's that you've got an agenda behind.
Yeah.
I noticed Gary Kent watching before there. I'm not sure if he's still there now, but I love his, just a little plug for his ministry. I think it's
Yes.
just he's got a similar kind of vibe to you, where you just have that nice. He's looking at the positive aspects of
He does.
Adventism and the gospel, and
And often our evangelists have been way ahead of some of the rest of us, you know. HMS Richards had a very Christ-centered approach. Whether he spelt out all the details of righteousness by faith correctly or not, he had a Christ-centered approach, and he was doing that decades before Heppenstall, Laurendale or Des was around, and laid the foundation for them in some ways.
He had a good sense of humour too. There's, I think, one audio recording on YouTube of him reflecting, because he'd met Ellen White or something as a young boy.
Yes.
And it's quite an interesting recount of that. And
yes, we don't meet many people today who had that privilege, do we?
I know.
But I remember as a kid, it would almost be like, you know, someone very special had come into the building when you'd heard they'd had that contact.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is a little bit of hagiography, but there we go.
So back to questions on doctrine, and back to Glacier View, as this is conversations part of a series on the 40th anniversary of Glacier View. I would say that, and it was interesting that Dr. Johnson said this too, that it was perhaps the greatest crisis that the Adventist Church has ever had or faced. What are your thoughts on that? We've had 1888, we've had 1903, we've had 1919, we've had Canwright, we've had Basinger, we've had
Ballinger.
Ballinger. I was thinking of Kate Basinger there.
The one we've been involved in ourselves probably always does seem like the greatest tours.
Historically,
was the Kellogg price actually greater?
From 1844 to now, though, has there been such an event that has caused such a schism?
No, I think the Kellogg thing did.
Interesting. In what way?
Well,
and unpack that a little bit.
Kellogg represented the health side of our work. You know, we've had these two arms.
The conflict that he and A.G. Daniels had, you mean?
And the larger church as well.
Yeah.
So really, as I understand it from what Bertoloviak has written, there were three streams there. There were traditionalists, there were progressives, and then there was Kellogg. And in the end, the progressives and the conservatives united together to deal with the pantheists. You know?
Yeah.
But that was a pretty big schism, and a pretty big. I'm not judging the rights or wrongs of all that happened, but it was a pretty big loss.
Was it resolved?
I don't think it was resolved.
No.
No.
So this could
Maybe we still had that tension between the health and the apocalyptic elements of the movement.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I suspect that the women's ordination thing has more ability to split the church than the Des Ford thing. It may end up a bigger crisis.
Does it have its roots, though, if my theory of QOD being ground zero for the current tensions? And
well, not every woman is a progressive as such.
No.
There are women in ministry who don't fit that mould. But I think with Des, some of the other scholars felt dragged into the conflict. It wasn't their fight, even though they may have agreed with some of what he was saying. I think with the women's ordination, the scholars were invited to give their opinions. They gave them and then largely got ignored. And I think there's a little more investment from the scholarly community on the topic, which could be more divisive in the end.
So that's an interesting view. And I think in your life that kind of puts a lot of things into perspective, where you're living the inspiration you've found from the gospel in your life as best you can, rather than bouncing from crisis to crisis and how it impacts or impacts.
I have enough personal crises in my life without adding them.
Maybe I just need the drama.
Well, I retired early or pulled out of work early. I haven't gone back, but because of post-traumatic stress syndrome, and I won't go into all the details of what that is. It's not about how the church treated me, this is for sure, because right from when I was in primary school, or even earlier, as far back as I can remember, the church always provided supportive community to me. So that's about other issues. But yes, I do have enough crises that go on without you having to bear the weight of a whole community at the same time.
Do you find, like when I talk to Dr. Johnson and Norm Young, and I said if there was conclusive evidence that nothing supernatural happened in 1844, would that kind of make it hard for you to still be an Adventist? And they were both quite happy to go, no, that doesn't make a difference. What do you think about 1844 as a, and how convinced are you that something supernatural happened?
I probably think about it a lot more than most Adventists in the pews do.
You probably do think about it.
That's not what I think about it, but just thinking about it. Look, I read the stories of their experience back there, and I weep with them. Yeah, I can mock at date setting when I see it today, like that guy that wanted the world to end back in, was it 2012 or something?
Yeah.
It didn't happen. And part of me can laugh at the stupidity of date setting, but I also weep with the story of what they went through.
Oh, what a disappointment.
And that is, well, literally. And that is something profound that should not be forgotten. The way we hold that with our faith today, there can be more than one answer to that. So, Crozier had his insight in the
cornfield.
Edson, which one was it had in the cornfield?
Did Crozier write about Edson's experience?
I think that's it. I need to get it right. I knew neither man, so I get them confused.
Yeah.
And we certainly wouldn't agree, even though Ellen White recommended Crozier's material. She herself did not agree with all that he wrote in it, and it's very hard to wade through. But the idea of investigative judgment came up later. It wasn't until the 1850s that was put in. They felt that a door was shut, another was open, but they didn't know what that meant.
Was Christ?
James White initially reacted against it.
Yeah.
He said, God knows who are his already. And, the investigative judgment scenario almost won through because there was nothing else left to fill in at the time very easily. Ellen White had many visions about the sanctuary. She didn't have visions about the investigative judgment as such. There's a subtle distinction there. So what we really face in some ways is what I read Norm Young describe in Spectrum some years ago. It's like another great disappointment, except that it's not focused on a specific date. It is focused on the way that time has simply gone on and on for generation after generation. What do these things mean? Now, the investigative judgment for our pioneers was a way of saying history hasn't fallen out of God's hands. Okay. The end didn't come when we expected, but it's still coming. Something began then that was important. The judgment of the dead began, and soon, none knows how soon it'll move to the living. Okay. We've lost that perspective a little bit. So I've got colleagues who I greatly respect who will say, the passage of time doesn't worry me. Whatever the passage of time, the investigative judgment began then, and that's that. But that's not what it meant for them. For them, it was a sign of the end. It was a sign of saying, we're about to step to the end after all. And it's very hard to say that now in the same way. Norm said the other day that you can have a judgment beginning in 1844 or a pre-Advent judgment, but you can't have both. And I hadn't really thought of it that way. And in a sense, he is right. I suspect he is on the mark there.
Yeah. That's what's confused me. The Bible says enough about the judgment in various forms. Why, unless you understand the context of the Great Disappointment, one would say, well, why did you need another one? And if
all the pioneers believed in a short pre-Advent judgment.
Beginning
in 1844. Today, some believe in a long pre-Advent judgment beginning in 1844. Others believe in a short one still to come. No one believes exactly what they believed, which was that it would be short and in 1844.
How convinced are you that something supernatural happened in heaven in 1844?
Supernatural's
on that date.
I don't know, and I'm not much worried. I respect their experience and learn from it and hold its validity. Even though they were very mistaken, I learned from what they went through. And I believe that, the teaching of pre-Advent judgment is important. Judgment reminds us that what we do matters. Okay. We're not just the flotsam jetsam of time and chance.
But can't you get that from the Bible's teachings on the judgment?
You can get that from the Bible, and you can get from the Bible that when they come up in the resurrection, they come up in one resurrection or the other. You can get all that from the Bible. Whether you have to tie it in with the specific date's another question in time.
Yeah.
I don't feel the need to. I don't feel the need to correct those who do, but I don't feel the need to have to do that myself. But I do honour and treasure their experience.
Yeah. Because, imagine how they felt. And maybe this was just a way of kind of helping to ease the pain. And whether you think it's supernatural or not, as I think Norm said the other day, it was providential maybe that Adventism began at that time.
I believe it was. Yeah, myself.
I then asked
That's a statement of faith. It's not something I can prove.
No, I then asked him, but aren't there lots of other providential movements that have begun? And why is Adventism considered as more special than other providential ones, other providential movements?
They were just too early.
Yeah.
That's about all we can say. And for all our talk of uniqueness, and there are unique aspects to it, the Baha'is believe in 1844.
Interesting, yeah.
And they're not even Christian. So we will hold on to it as a last thread of absolute distinctiveness. Yet I had some Baha'is say to me, oh, yes, that was your great disappointment, wasn't it? Ha ha. Yeah, because they weren't disappointed. Their prophet arrived on time.
Yeah, that's right. What's the distinct thing for them is that's when their prophet began. What's his name?
A manifestation higher than a prophet, on the level of Moses or Christ himself. Or Muhammad, as they would have it, because they have an interfaith thing going on. But they believe the Bab, the gate, appeared in 1844 in fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. So, when you share a distinctive, more or less, with a non-Christian group, yeah, maybe we make too much of just being distinctive.
Distinctive, maybe. Yeah. Do you think
It's a whole package that matters, not the individual arrangement of elements.
do you think that, like, if you look at the Mormon Church and all the good that they do, and the focus on the family, and they allow their kids to dance to rock music, that's
Yeah, there's a good thing, Peter.
that's a good thing. And
You realise Ellen White's second cousin, Agnes Coolbrith, was married to Joseph Smith. She was one of his wives.
what? No, I didn't know that.
That's a whole other study.
Oh my goodness. Who was it? Her what?
Well, I think it was her first cousin once removed. It may have been a cousin of her parents. I don't think they ever met.
That explains why one of
But
her
they had their first visions in a similar part of New England.
and one of her visions is similar to one of his visions.
Well,
That explains it. Maybe there's a connection.
there's a cultural connection, because Wesley sounds similar to Alan as well.
Yeah. So if you look at all the good things about Mormonism today,
Yeah.
and you're chatting to a young Mormon that's just found out that the Book of Abraham turns out to be based on error and forgery, and you're
Certainly
shaken,
not the way
and you.
I don't know how many Mormons know that and still remain in the movement.
This is what I was going to
They
say.
have their conservative and progressive wings as well, and how that all fits together for them, I have no idea, which would make it very hard for me to judge what was happening.
I know, and I guess if I was a Mormon, this is again me, not judging what anyone else does, that would plant a seed to me to eventually leave that religion, no matter how good it was. If people
their
claims
for Joseph Smith are a little bit different to ours.
they
make what he has produced into scripture. Now, in practice, we often enough do the same with Ellen White, but in theory, we never have. She never did. So that puts it in a different plane. I'd be very wary of a third testament, as it were.
That's why I kind of am looking forward to chatting with Ken Samples, because Walter Martin was, prior to his death, was saying that he felt that Ellen White was being elevated to a certain status and level that was putting her almost canonical.
Well, Walter Martin was disturbed that we wouldn't republish Questions on Doctrine, was he? Wasn't
Yeah. Why wasn't it?
Yeah, we did publish it in the end, but with commentary.
Right, but it's not available now. Why?
It's gone out again now, has it?
I think so. I might be wrong, but it was definitely not published for a while.
Oh, it's not published for a while, but in the 2000s, George Knight and some others got together and published an annotated version of it.
Right, but not recognised by the GC anymore.
I don't know. How many of our publications are actually officially recognised by the GC anyway? I guess initially
that was initially, yeah, initially it
they
was.
initially did publish it,
and that was why it had so much power.
Yes, yeah, it looked like an official word from the mountain.
Mm. So if you were a Mormon and found out about the Book of Abraham, you would probably remain a Mormon, except that you're saying that the elevation of him is different to the elevation of Ellen White.
Yes.
Right.
That would be a big factor in me moving away from it.
Right.
Plus, I think the basic model of Adventism, as I understand it, fits the Bible better. But then I'm an Adventist, I would say that. The Mormon may not. I was reading the other day a comment by Malcolm Bull, was it, and Lockhart, the two writers on Adventist history.
I'm not sure.
Be good if you could get an interview with them.
Yeah.
I don't think they're any longer Adventists. One of them may never have been. But he said that you have the Mormons and the Seventh-day Adventist pioneers in American history, and you've got this tension with post-millennialism between the American side and the Christian side. And you have the Adventists emphasizing the Christian side and the Mormons emphasizing the American side.
Ah.
But then I thought of how Mitt Romney had stood up to the American president and Ben Carson hadn't quite so.
Yeah.
Sometimes it works out the opposite way.
Yes.
That's enough of politics.
I feel like there's a whole other conversation right
Oh,
there.
yes.
So, what would you say then? Are you some of your, we'll start to wind down unless there's some questions that I can notice over here or read even.
If you can read them.
And I'd invite anyone if you'd like to pop up a question now to do so, and I'll try and read it. What are some of your takeaway highlights of questions on doctrine? I know we've kind of talked perhaps a lot more outside of Glacier View than, but I'd kind of intended that when we chatted because I want Glacier View to be set in a context of the broader things that you and I have been talking about tonight, to help give it perspective, and so it doesn't kind of turn into a ignition point, perhaps. So, what are some?
I haven't looked at questions on doctrine for years, to be honest. My mother's copy sank when I went to New Guinea.
Yes.
Some of our goods in the shipment sank and were never to be recovered again. So I never did replace it because it wasn't in print anymore anyway.
That's right.
So I lost touch with that a little bit.
But just, I guess, your feeling. What was some of the takeaway?
The things I got on questions on doctrine, as I mentioned earlier, were basic defences of Adventist positions, like the Sabbath, like on law and grace, like even on the sanctuary, and it was expressed in a very positive way. I think they took due consideration of their audience, but also of their own convictions, and those were the things that attracted me to the book. The Ellen White appendixes on the nature of Christ and so forth, and on the atonement. I didn't hear those issues being debated in my church. So I was keeping to the main chapters, not to the very important appendices at the back, because I didn't realise where that was all coming from anyway.
It seems to me that within Adventism, whenever there are tensions, there is often common ground. Like O.K. Anderson, his brother was one of the ones that was on the committee for
yes, Roy Allen. And I understand from what Ruth Allen's father told me, Peter, that Roy had changed position in his later years. The sort of pro-questions on doctrine at the start, but ended up with a different position.
Oh, interesting. So he came into line more with O.K. Anderson, who was a signee of the Concerned Brethren document.
So people sometimes live different parts of the story in their own lifetime.
Yeah, that's right. And we're not robots. We don't hear something and then go bang. Like I knew all this stuff in the mid-'80s and into the early 90s where I was kind of really researching it, but I didn't really take any action on it until 4 years ago. So we all ebb and flow, and imagine looking at someone's life as they do with Ellen White, and you take everything she said and you try and make it this one composite thing. But
it reminds me of a guy who decided to live by the Torah for 12 months.
Right.
But, you know, at my current stage of life, I'm reminded of what Richard Raw, who was a Catholic, said.
Yes.
Is a Catholic father. And he said, if you try and live the second half of your life on the same modus operandi as the first half, you'll kill yourself. Yeah.
Yes. Oh.
And that's really been important to me. I was concerned about theoretical constructs of truth in the first half of my life. These days, I'm concerned about actually living life and living it in the presence of God's grace, whether it's with my kids or other people. Or...
Yeah. Oh, and look, if people thought that I'm personally hung up on all this stuff, I'm so not, you know.
Well, you have a life, obviously. You have a life.
I love life. My days are spent with my 6-year-old and 7-year-old and our new little dog Spot. I don't know if you saw pictures of him on Facebook.
I think I did.
And my partner Barbara, and you know, I'm enjoying living life. Hey, I'll grab the I can just see if I can hold this up a little bit.
See if you can read it.
Gillian Ford has written, Froome,
Okay.
Reed, and Anderson, and they were nicknamed Freda, I remember. So that would be Roy Anderson, someone Reed, and the guy Froome.
Okay.
What was Froome's first name? Can't remember.
Leroy Edwin.
Leroy, yeah. Um, and I think Andreessen kind of came along later and was like, hang on, you guys, he was quite a scholar of the day.
Andreessen, to be distinguished from Niels Erik, who is not a relative.
Sorry, you cut out just then. Say that again.
That Andreessen is to be distinguished from Niels Erik Andreessen, the
Yes.
former, briefly Avondale lecturer and president of Andrews University. It's important to say, but they're not even related.
No relation.
No relation.
Um,
And I was drawn to Andreessen's book because I didn't understand his book on the Hebrews. I didn't understand its implications. Yeah, I understood those books far better under the ministry of Norm Young and so forth at college later. But I
right.
remember Pastor Nobby Burns, who used to be at Avondale and was no liberal.
Mm.
He saw me on the Melbourne campground with a book, probably wondered what a teenager was doing with a book like that. And he said, oh, there were some problems and objections to that book, And I said, no, I didn't know that. I said, can we chat about it sometime? He said, come back and see me on such a day.
Oh, wow.
And he really didn't want to talk about the book at all. He wanted to affirm me in deciding to do theology at Avondale.
Right.
And that was in the days of Des, and Nobby Burns still made that affirmation. So,
yeah, interesting.
yeah, I respect and admire the man for that because I don't think he was on the same page theologically.
Yeah.
It still affirmed my wish and heart's desire to study for ministry.
Also, Brian Beeden has said, questions on doctrine, annotated issue by George R. Knight, reprinted in 2003 by Andrews University Press. It was intended to be published in a SDA historical series, no longer available. And we've got a question for Ross from Peter Mashenko. What would you say to people who are very concerned about 1844 and would be concerned about you being relatively phlegmatic about the importance of it?
Oh, the important thing is Christ and is in the cross. And it is important to say that the atonement happened there. I'm not compromising on that.
Mm.
What would I say to them? I'd ask them to get their priority in the right place and then talk about the other things.
Mm. Mm. Good answer.
The experience of our pioneers is not unimportant. If we don't learn from our experiences, we learn nothing. But it is what the Bible actually teaches us that is important, most of all.
Well, Ross, I could talk to you for hours, and I'm looking forward to COVID being less interfering in our lives, and let's catch up for a nice vegetarian gluten burger at the takeaway. I think in a week or two they're going to be lifting and we'll be able to do that. So I'd love to continue this conversation.
Thank you, Peter.
I'd love to have you back on SDA&A again. Can you just share with us, as a kind of a parting comment, any inspirational words of wisdom? And also before that, just some of your memories of that 6 months with Des Ford as a lecturer.
Yeah, the memories were quite profound. It was life and teachings. It was a Gospels class. At that stage, Avondale classes ran over the whole year. He taught us the first 6 months of that class, and he was very inspirational, and would often not go the whole period. It was a large class, about 150 students probably, but he would finish in half an hour, say what he had to say.
Interesting.
And it was always impressive to see him on campus striding his walkout. He could walk faster than most of us could run.
A lot of people that
you come across him coming like a prophet out of the bush.
It stopped people. It hindered people stopping him and asking complicated questions. It just kept going. A lot of people.
He would probably have just said, "Come and join me," if you did ask a complicated question.
A lot of people who recount their memories, they'll often say, "I was walking with Des one day, and he said this." So there was lots of Steve Jobs was like that too, apparently, of Apple.
Yeah, and Des's connections to my family go back a way because he was a student at Avondale College when my grandfather was a mature age student
Oh, right.
in the late 40s. My aunt, Lorna Butcher, who has children still in Cooranbong, she helped nurse Gwen at times. She was like a second mother to Alan. So Des connections run deep.
Deep, yeah.
My grandfather spoke of Des with the highest admiration because my grandfather was a man of deep love, even though he wasn't always focused on the theological issues. And I've had people who've opposed Des. At Andrews, I had one professor who was very clearly not on Des's side, but he said, "I overman my life for teaching me righteousness by faith." That's a tremendous legacy, and the legacy continues in the other things he drew our attention to as well, to say, are these consistent with the gospel or not? They remain important questions. But when you hear someone who's written against the man, but he says, "I owe him my life,"
it's interesting.
That is a tremendous legacy.
Do you think if Glacier View happened today that Des would be kicked out?
I don't know that it would happen today. I think if they were going to kick someone out, they'd do it before all the meeting and all the rest.
Yeah.
Probably the meeting was essential in some ways because the scholars and administrative types had not been talking. In our early Adventist history, they were one and the same. There was scarcely an administrator amongst us who wasn't also a scholar of some note, even though they didn't have the degrees and credentials. They knew how to debate and discuss those issues.
Yeah.
It was inevitable that some crisis was going to happen after Pearson, I think.
Yeah.
And in some ways, Des was sort of a collateral to a process that was bigger than any of us.
Do you think when it comes, this is the 40th anniversary, when it comes to the 50th, do you think people will still be talking about Glacier View?
Oh, they'll talk about it as long as time goes on.
Do you think there will be resolution within the church? You're quite positive that things are going to get better?
I don't know, to be honest. I despair sometimes of the corporate church. I rejoice at experiences like I had in Papua New Guinea with my students and what I see, the fruit I see there. And I realise that the corporate church helps facilitate some of those things. So there's a little bit of a tension there for me.
Should a split be avoided at all costs?
Not at all costs. People have to maintain their integrity. And I guess each is answerable to God for how they do that. Sometimes that means going on a crusade. Sometimes I think it means simply being yourself and refusing to budge from that.
Yeah. It manifests itself in many ways.
Yeah.
Any parting words of wisdom? And I've been calling you Ross all night instead of Dr. Ross. Is that all right?
That's fine. Ross is fine. Yeah, grace and blessings to you and to all those who've stopped by to listen and will do so.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being a part of this series, Ross. Your contribution is greatly valued.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it.
And we'll bring you back to the current time. Those that are listening on the podcast, we're now back in March 2025. And Ross Cole and I have just watched the interview he and I did in 2020. That was the Glacier View Retrospective 40 years. This is 45 years. And I mentioned just there, I wonder if people will still be talking about it at the 50th anniversary. And you said, yep, it's going to be talked about for a long, long time. I'm going to get you to share some reflections on that interview. And those who are watching, feel free to write in the comments as well. And just a big thank you to SDAkinship.org for sponsoring today's program. It was interesting there, Ross. In the middle of the program, I thanked today's sponsors, Kinship, and then when I went back to play the interview, I asked, are there any kind of groups? So this was obviously 5 years ago, was pre me knowing.
Serendipity.
And then we go back into the interview and I immediately say, are there groups? And you said, well, there's Kinship. And there's a few ironies there. So, thank you, Kinship. And I encourage those watching to go and check out their website, sdakinship.org. So, Ross, tell us your thoughts on today's program. As we watched it back, we were very good. I've been trying to just watch the program without interrupting it, without commentary going through. It's good to just see it in its full glory and context. And then I thought, those who go, cool, we've seen that, now we can go off to bed or have lunch or do whatever. And then those who want to stick around for a little bit of a Q&A and commentary can hang around as well. So share us your thoughts on watching yourself 5 years ago and the things you said and any changes you'd make to what you said.
It's the longest I've ever watched myself on playback. I don't remember saying those specific things, but I remember sitting here and hearing myself and sort of anticipating what I would say now, and it was very similar. You kindly said I hadn't appeared to age over the 5 years, Peter. But the truth is I have aged. I have a little Parkinson's disease, and my responses may not be quite as quick and sharp now because of that deterioration.
I didn't know
it's
that.
It's okay, but I am reminded that I am certainly mortal.
Well, yes, and I'm aware that 5 years has also taken its toll a little bit on me. And I think as you get older, I think every 5 years you look like when the difference between 35 and 40, no one can tell. But as you get a little bit older,
between 60 and 65 is a little bit sharper. For most of us.
And
so I wouldn't change a lot of what I said then. There are a couple of things I did note though that I didn't say at the time. One is conspiracy theorizing is common enough, I mentioned, but I think in the last 5 years it's increased. So in many ways we live in a post-truth world. Truth is whatever the alternative facts make it out to be. It's very hard now with deep fake videos possible and all the rest to know what is really happening.
Yeah.
Confusion from conspiracy has grown. And I think conspiracy theorizing is particularly common in societies that have three things. One is a war of conquest that laid the foundation of a society, such as in Australia and America. The other is a war of independence, and the other is civil war. Australia's had one of those, America's had all three. So it doesn't surprise me that America is the birthplace of a lot of conspiracy theories. And it doesn't surprise me that Adventism being birthed in America has become a home to some of them as well. The other thing I'd notice is that prophecy is hard to interpret. Prophecy is always understood perfectly with hindsight. Hindsight is 20/20 vision, as they say. Anyone who can dogmatize about a particular date from the prophetic writings is exceedingly brief. I don't think we can do that. And that thought occurred to me in a way I hadn't expressed earlier, but I would express now, noticing some of the comments on the side. I would say, it's very hard to dogmatize about the specific dates involved.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah, and I have noticed that a lot of the Adventist apologist scholars and academics watering down the specific focus of that date. Some are saying, well, it was in that time period, or it was a metaphor, or hey, it was God just reminding us, generally speaking, that the time of the end is soon. I think because anyone that puts a little bit of thought into it soon realizes that you can't really defend that kind of dogmatic date setting.
Yeah.
And
usually
Andy,
when prophecy is fulfilled, we have some external event that sort of confirms it to us.
yes,
Right
yeah,
in 44, we only have our own insights to go off. We don't have something that sticks as a firm date historically.
yeah. It's a speculative religion in some ways because people are hoping and speculating that the prophecy will be fulfilled in the return of Jesus and the investigative judgment, culminating in the close of probation and this kind of thing. As I've continued on since that interview, 5 years ago, I've found and dug deep into some of these Adventist quirks and find them quite ludicrous now in many ways. And I know that Adventist apologists trying to defend those specific doctrines and dogmas have a struggle if they are the kind of Adventist apologist that actually enjoys some scholarly discovery. So I kind of I'm still fascinated by it.
Well, so am
But
I.
I'm just more fascinated now with like what makes someone want to defend those, like what you've just said there is, look, it's not worth defending that kind of dogma, but there are people out there who are as um what's forgotten the word, as good as you are at study and scholarly work, who kind of know that some of this stuff isn't adding up, but they still love to defend it. You're kind of from the position of, well, it is what it is. Here are the things about Adventism I love. These kind of things I'm not even going to try.
Seems your screen frozen, Peter.
I think we're back on again now.
We're back
Ross.
on again now.
We're back on, I think.
Yes.
Yes, we
Can you hear me?
are. I can hear you. And let me just fix a couple of things here. I don't know what we lost or what went down there, but I was just saying that some Adventist apologists of an academic scholarly nature, even though they've gone, behind the scenes, they're going, there's no way I can defend this stuff. They still continue to try doing so. And I value that you're going, well, I think one of the questions I asked you, you said, I don't know. And it's okay to say, I don't know. And it's okay to say, hey, that's too hard to justify and rationalize, so I'm just not going there. Why do you think some of the more scholarly type of academic Adventist apologists still try and fit the square pegs into the round holes?
I don't have any vast disagreement with those who want to hold to the traditional dates. I just don't see that you can dogmatise about it. If they feel called to run to their defence, and that's okay.
Right.
personally not a very profitable exercise. I'm more focused on the meaning of the time, meaning of the experiences that the pioneers went through, not the exact dating.
Andy Mack wrote, I think questions on doctrine may have saved Adventism from getting way too out there.
Yeah,
I think she might be
he's
right.
Yeah.
And there is definitely a post QOD, that came out in 1957 and really influenced the general Christian body in how it looked at Adventism, and it softened its view on, and many people joined the Adventist Church post QOD between 1964ish to 1984. The membership went from 1 million to 4 million members, and I think a lot of that is to do with this softening view that people now saw the Adventist Church post QOD, and got a little friend. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on
that
that?
was referred to in our
Well,
5 years ago?
It's interesting when I mentioned when we're watching 5 years that Renee and Ruby were 6 and 7. Now they're 11 and 12, and this is the replacement spot. This is replacement spot.
He's looking at young.
And looks very similar, but sadly, Spot, went up onto Freeman's Drive one day and didn't come back. So, so that one you just saw, there's Pocket. So this idea that in some ways the post QOD environment created a more appealing and Adventism, and people gravitated to it, and the membership grew astoundingly over that next 20 years.
But it's continued to grow.
Yeah.
Just years ago. I mean, I don't know what the figures are currently, but they're well over 20 million, I think. Rather than 1 or 4.
I think they're heading close to 28 million, but there's some studies being done recently that suggest those numbers are a little bit inflated. And Dr. Trim, I think he released something recently that said since 1964, 18 million Adventists have left the church, and that they're now at a 42% apostasy rate. And keep in mind, most Adventists who do leave don't take their name off the roll. So
on the other hand, when you look at the census in different countries, there appear to be a lot of people identify as Adventists that we don't know about.
Yeah.
Because the figures in the census that who says they're Adventists is enormous by comparison to the people we know about. So it's true, the roles don't reflect full active engagement, but there are levels of engagement that people see in their own lives that aren't reflected anywhere in the roles even. So
I guess I'm trying to say, I wonder if the church grew rapidly because of QOD's presentation of the church to the world, and because it created a culture within the church that fostered the likes of Des Ford and Cottrell and Heppenstall and Valentine and all these good folk. Whereas as the church has now headed back to a more fundamental historicist traditional Adventism, I wonder if that is now reflecting numbers growing less. I don't know. I need to talk to a statistician about that.
Yeah. Is there anything you noticed, Peter, in the questions that arose while we were talking, while we were reviewing the past discussion?
Yeah.
I noticed the reference to Kellogg and the vast amounts of unhealthy food produced by Kellogg's today. We have to remember there were two brothers involved. W.K. Kellogg was a cereal brother, and John Kellogg was a medical doctor, and they didn't see eye to eye.
Yeah.
I'm told, in fact, that John Harvey Kellogg was a little bit perturbed by his brother's mass processing of cereals. They're not the same individual, and they didn't see eye to eye. They conflicted quite strenuously.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I think Dr. Rick Ferret has done a whole book and PhD study, I think, on the Kellogg's and that time period as well. And you'd know Rick. We should ask him and
Yes.
find out what's going on there. I interviewed him about it actually, so I should know.
Yeah.
Moto Sapien writes, the big question about end time, and even Paul saying it was the time, is why the delay, what is keeping Jesus from coming? The answer says a lot about your view of God, how you answer that question. That's very, good question there. Good point.
Probably the key question that we face in terms of Adventism's changing doctrinal horizons is the question of the apparent delay and what we make of it.
Yes, and Advent.
Sooner these questions wouldn't have arisen in the same way.
Yeah, and Adventism seems to be on a knife edge where it's not a broad, this middle ground in Adventism is not a nice broad one. You're kind of walking along this thin knife edge, and you're either going to just slip down into last generation theology and legalism, or you're going to slip down into Ross Cole, Larry Garrity, big tent, Bill Johnson style Adventism. I guess in some ways, and it's interesting that this has just popped into my head actually, in many ways, I just wish Adventism had a broader middle ground. It seems to be a tightrope, and you're going to fall one way or the other. And great if you fall the Ross Cole way, but not so great if you fall the last generation theology way.
It's an interesting observation. Andy Mack has commented, no, they both produced processed food. Kellogg produced the first fake meat. And I would agree. I still think that WK went further than John Harvey. But yeah, Kellogg produced fake meat in the hope people would move from the fake meat to vegetable meals. But the end of the story is that people tend to settle on the fake meat for a lot longer than that.
Yeah. There's some good plant-based fake meat out there, by the way. Just lately, I've got some low iron, so I've actually been eating some meat. But in exploring the whole vegetarian side, I'm trying to find plant-based meat stuff that also is high in iron and whatnot. And there's some good stuff out there at the moment.
Yeah.
Moto Sapien has asked a question, Dr. Cole. I'd asked that since you'd mentioned reading Arthur Maxwell as a kid, if you'd read his son Graham. He was a theologian from Loma Linda, and he wrote, "Can God Be Trusted?" But yeah, what do you know about him?
I've read some of Graham. I'm well aware of him. I haven't read any of his books from cover to cover. Very positive view of God, very gentle. Some would say into moral influence theory and would oppose him on their grounds, but that's a whole other discussion, I think.
That's our next conversation, and I hope I get you back on, Ross, before the 50th anniversary. Can you just imagine? This will happen if you or I are still going. If we're still alive, I'm going to be inviting you back in 5 years to rewatch this interview, which will include. It's going to get very complicated with little windows.
You get very long interviews.
So I'm looking forward to that. Darren Pratt has said, Peter Dixon, good to see you getting financial sponsors, Peter, keeping the show on the road. And how much is sponsorship? Thank you for asking that, Darren. If you would like to sponsor, I'm offering people to go and have a look at the list of the 86 interviews I did season 2. And you can choose someone there to sponsor, and you can sponsor either, as I've done today, with a link to something you'd like, or as I did last week with Dr. David Thiel. He sponsored the Norm Young program. I just mentioned his name, that he sponsored it. So you can use it just with your name or a link or a book or anything you
I
like.
didn't realise David's a good friend of mine, but I didn't realise
Yeah.
he'd done that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so if you'd like to sponsor, it's $150, which is nothing compared to the amount of exposure these programs will get ongoing for years and years. So if you'd like to sponsor, let me know. I can't even remember who's next week. I think it might be Ken Samples. So I'll be contacting him to see if he wants to do a commentary like today. And if you'd like to make a general donation to what I'm doing, you can visit PayPal there.me/Peter Dixon Music. So yeah, it really, really helps because it is more time consuming. But I think this topic of Des Ford and Glacier View is important to keep in the public eye. And it's a defining moment in Adventist history. And Bill Johnson says perhaps even more so than 1888. So yeah, I'm enjoying being able to contribute these 86 interviews into the public world. One last thing I'll say about that, Ross, Facebook has just changed their policies about a month ago, and they are slowly deleting all live videos. So sadly, in our Facebook group, these 86 interviews, which are stored there in the private group, at the moment they're only available there. But I'm slowly, as you know, putting them up on YouTube. They will slowly be deleted, which is really sad because that was going to be, that was going to be the place that I kept them as the home of that important seminal season 2. And already I just got a notice that the Bill Johnson one is going to be deleted in 2 days. And I'm like, whoa. So I'm so glad that I already have been uploading to YouTube, but that soon, yours will be deleted. Norm Young's will be deleted. So very important that we get these up onto YouTube. So that makes the sponsorship more important, if you don't mind, than what I'm doing. Because I now have, deletion of our live book resource catalog like behind me, kind of chasing after me like a hound. And so that's made this process even more important of weekly putting up these episodes. Actually, John Rosier might be next. Anyway, I'm not too sure, but I'll check. So thank you again, Ross, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, so we'll very much look forward to seeing you around town on the show again at any point. Think of any topic you'd like to chat about.
We don't have
And
to
if
wait
not,
another 5 years.
I was just going to say, if not 5 years' time.
For sure. Blessings.
Take care, and thank you, everyone. We'll see you all next week. And tomorrow we've got our Good News Fellowship around this time as well. We'll see you there. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.